Riverside Park, bathed in the soft warmth of the afternoon sun, was a quiet refuge from the chaotic city streets. The air smelled of fresh grass, mingling with the distant scent of street vendors' hot dogs. The sound of children laughing and playing echoed through the park, and a light breeze rustled the leaves in the nearby trees. Samantha Turner, a 34-year-old lawyer, sat on a weathered bench, her hands folded over a book she had been reading for the past hour. For her, this was a rare moment of peace. Life in the courthouse was often a blur of deadlines, courtroom dramas, and relentless pressure. But here, in the park, she could breathe. She sighed deeply, letting the warmth of the sun wash over her as she turned the page. It had been a long morning, another tough case, so she relished the small break before heading back to the office. But across the park, Officer Brian Harris, patrolling his usual route, noticed something that made him pause. Samantha, a black woman sitting alone, calm and composed, caught his eye. He had been patrolling Riverside Park for years, and in all that time he had learned to trust his instincts. Something about the woman didn't sit right with him. She seemed out of place. He squinted in her direction, narrowing his eyes. There was no real reason for his suspicion, no legitimate evidence, but a thought crept into his mind. A woman like her, alone in the park, doesn't fit the profile. Samantha, absorbed in her book, hadn't noticed the officer's gaze, but something made her look up. She met his eyes across the park. The moment was brief, but in it, she recognized that look, a look she had seen far too many times, suspicion without cause, a judgment based solely on the color of her skin. She let out a quiet sigh, knowing exactly how this would unfold. The officer began walking toward her, his posture stiff, his hand subtly resting near his holster. Samantha's heart rate didn't spike. She wasn't afraid. She had dealt with moments like this before, and she wasn't about to let this officer's assumptions get the better of her. "Afternoon," he said, his tone polite but sharp, as he stopped in front of her. Samantha smiled politely, closing her book and resting it gently on her lap. Her hands remained visible, unthreatening. "Afternoon, officer," she replied, keeping her tone calm, almost neutral. Officer Harris studied her closely, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary. He couldn't quite put his finger on why he felt unsettled, but something about her, sitting there so composed, didn't match the expectations he had formed in his mind. A woman like her, so well put together, on a park bench in broad daylight. She was too calm, too relaxed. He had seen this before. It was the kind of person who often stood out when they didn't belong, or at least that's how it felt to him. His instincts were never wrong. They couldn't be. He had patrolled this area for over 20 years, seen people of all types. And yet, here was this black woman, her skin, her clothing, her ease in the public space. Everything felt off. She was too out of place in this neighborhood. His grip tightened slightly on his baton as he took a step closer. "What brings you out here today?" Harris asked, trying to keep his voice steady, his suspicion still simmering beneath the surface. Samantha paused for a moment, her calm eyes meeting his. "Just enjoying the park," she answered, keeping her voice even, yet holding a quiet authority that made the officer uncomfortable. She didn't flinch under his gaze, didn't look away. It was almost as though she knew what was coming. That was what unsettled him the most. Harris continued to stare at her, eyes flicking to the book in her lap, then back to her face. He had heard nothing but praise for the neighborhood, how the park had always been safe. He had seen countless people sitting on the benches, reading, minding their business, but none of them had been black. None of them had given him that feeling that something was wrong. "You from around here?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Samantha smiled slightly, but the gesture didn't reach her eyes. "I've been around," she answered, her words measured. She wasn't giving him much, and Harris wasn't pleased by that. His mind was still reeling from the feeling he couldn't shake. Harris's posture shifted. His hand hovered near his holster, but he didn't yet reach for it. This was the part where he needed to regain control. If she wasn't going to give him what he wanted, answers, clarity, he had every right to escalate the situation. He felt his temper flaring, the suspicion growing stronger. "Mind if I see some ID?" he asked, his tone now more demanding than before. Samantha's smile faltered, but she remained composed. "Am I under arrest?" she asked, her voice measured, the words almost too polite for the heavy atmosphere between them. She could feel the heat rising in his body language, could see the tension building, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of making her nervous. Harris blinked, caught off guard. No one had ever asked him that before. He had always been the one to ask questions, to impose his authority. But Samantha, with that calm and collected stare, was testing his limits. Her question hung in the air for a moment, heavy with defiance and clarity. "You'll be under arrest if you don't cooperate," he shot back, his voice rising just enough to signal he was nearing the edge. Samantha didn't flinch. Instead, she nodded slowly, her expression unwavering. "I'm just sitting in a park. Is there a law against that?" The officer's patience was thinning rapidly. His frustration was evident in the way his hand twitched near his belt. He was starting to lose control of the situation, and that unsettled him. He stepped closer, now towering over her. The words in his mind formed an excuse, a justification for his actions. But even as he spoke, they felt weak. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he muttered, though he knew how flimsy that explanation was. A vague lead, a general description of a suspect. But it was enough. Or so he thought. His posture became more confrontational, as though willing her to crumble beneath the weight of his authority. Samantha didn't move. Her gaze stayed fixed on him, steady, unflinching. She had known this moment was coming. She had seen it too many times in her life. The officer who thought their authority was above reproach, the bias wrapped in the guise of law and order. She knew her rights, but she also understood the delicate balance of pushing back and maintaining her own safety. "And what description is that?" she asked quietly, her voice calm but firm. There was no anger in her tone, just a quiet confidence. The question made Harris hesitate. He had no solid answer, no real justification for his actions beyond his gut feeling. His jaw clenched, and his face reddened, the internal battle visible to Samantha as he struggled to maintain his composure. He couldn't admit to himself that this was about race. He couldn't acknowledge that he was about to arrest someone based on nothing more than their appearance. He wasn't about to lose face now. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, his tone harsher now. "Show me some ID now." The moment stretched, and for a split second, Samantha considered her options. She could challenge him, argue, escalate the situation further. But that wouldn't help. Not today. Instead, she slowly reached into her bag, her movements deliberate. Harris watched every motion like a hawk. He was tense, ready for any sign of resistance, any excuse to make the situation official. When Nike. Her hand emerged. She handed him her ID, her fingers steady, almost too controlled. Harris grabbed it from her with a little more force than necessary, his eyes scanning it, looking for any reason to justify his actions. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he needed to find something. Anything. The name on the ID didn't ring any bells, and that only fueled his frustration. As Officer Harris gripped Samantha's ID, he stared at it, searching for something, anything, that could justify the situation. But there was nothing. He recognized the name now, but it didn't mean much to him. The recognition was fleeting. Not enough to change the fact that he had already made up his mind. Samantha could see the moment the officer realized his gut feeling, his suspicion, wasn't enough to hold up. He wasn't looking at her like a criminal anymore. Instead, the uncertainty in his eyes grew. But it wasn't enough to stop him. "Stand up," he ordered sharply, his voice tight as he tried to regain control of the situation. He backed away from the bench, the weight of the cuffs on his belt now heavier than before. He needed to assert authority. He had to follow through. Samantha stood slowly, keeping her movements deliberate and controlled. She didn't want to give him any reason to escalate things further, but she wouldn't be intimidated. Her hands rested at her sides, clearly visible, showing she had no intention of fleeing or fighting. She had already been through enough of these encounters to know what was coming next. She could feel the officer's frustration, the palpable tension in the air as he struggled with his own prejudices and the growing realization that he was out of his depth. But even as the officer's breath quickened, Samantha remained calm. Inside, however, a quiet anger began to simmer. This wasn't just about her. It was about every black person who had ever been stopped, searched, or accused based solely on their skin color. Harris's voice was tense now, sharp with authority as he ordered her to turn around. "Turn around!" he demanded, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Samantha took a slow breath. Her instinct screamed at her to resist, but she knew that wasn't the right move. Not yet. She needed to handle this carefully, strategically. She would fight this, but not in the way the officer expected. Turning around, she let him cuff her wrists without resistance. The metal was cold, biting into her skin as he secured the cuffs too tightly. She felt the discomfort, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she steadied her breathing, knowing that every second of this interaction mattered, even if it wasn't in the way the officer thought. Is this really happening? She thought to herself. Is this how the system works? This is what they've been talking about. Racial profiling, discrimination, the system I'm supposed to trust. As the officer led her toward the patrol car, she could feel the eyes of the bystanders on her, some with sympathetic looks, others with curiosity. A few pulled out their phones, recording the scene. She wasn't surprised. This was just another moment in the endless cycle of bias and injustice. She was used to it. She had witnessed it for years, and now it was her turn to stand in the center of it. Samantha's mind raced, but she kept her face neutral. She knew she had to remain calm. Anything could go wrong if she let her emotions take over, and she had too much at stake to lose control now. As the officer shoved her into the back of the squad car, the cold metal seat biting into her legs, she looked out the window. The park she had just been sitting in, peaceful and serene, was now behind her. She could see the people watching from a distance, some still filming, others whispering among themselves. She knew how this would play out in their minds. The black woman in cuffs, the cop doing his job. But she also knew how the story would unfold in the legal world. Officer Harris shut the door and walked around to the front of the car, climbing into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life, and the car pulled away from the park, heading toward the precinct. The city blurred past them, the buildings, streets, and people all moving in a chaotic rhythm, unaware of the injustice unfolding in the back of the car. Inside, Samantha felt the tension in her chest tighten. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about this one moment. It was about the systemic issues that had been ingrained for years. The power imbalance, the racial profiling, the way people like her were treated every day, and in that moment, she knew that she couldn't let this slide. She wasn't going to let this officer, this system, get away with it. She knew who she was, and that mattered more than anything right now. The fact that she was a state lawyer wasn't going to protect her here, but she could use that knowledge to protect others. She would make sure this officer and the system would answer for what had happened. As the patrol car pulled into the precinct's parking lot, Officer Harris glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of Samantha's calm face. Her gaze met his unblinking. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. His mind was racing now, caught between his duty and the sinking feeling that something was terribly wrong. He hadn't meant for this to escalate this way, but his own biases had led him to make decisions he couldn't take back. He had arrested an innocent woman, a lawyer, a professional, and it was too late to undo what he had done. He parked the car, his movements jerky, as though he couldn't quite shake off the unease. He stepped out of the car and opened the back door, escorting Samantha toward the entrance. Inside the precinct, the usual buzz of activity filled the air. Officers were going through paperwork, phones were ringing, and there was the steady hum of conversation. But everything felt different now. It felt off. As they approached the booking area, Samantha's mind shifted from the anger she had felt earlier to a deeper sense of determination. She had to make this right. She had to make sure no one else was ever treated like this. Officer Harris hesitated, unsure of what to do next. His earlier confidence had disappeared, replaced by a creeping doubt. He handed over her ID to the officer behind the desk, who looked up with a flicker of recognition. The young officer behind the desk paused, glancing at Samantha's ID, then back at her. "Wait, I think I know her," he muttered under his breath. But before the officer could say anything more, Captain Laura Bennett, who had been standing nearby, walked over. "Officer Harris," she said in a firm tone. "What's going on here?" Captain Laura Bennett's sharp gaze swept over Officer Harris as she approached, her steps purposeful. Samantha stood still, her back straight, her face a mask of calm determination. She hadn't spoken a word since being brought into the precinct, but her mind was racing. She knew this moment could be pivotal not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. Bennett, a woman in her early 40s with short dark hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, eyed the situation. She could sense something was off, though Officer Harris was doing his best to appear unfazed. As soon as she saw Samantha's ID, recognition flickered in her eyes, but she kept her professional demeanor intact. She looked at Harris, her voice firm but composed. "Officer Harris," she said, her tone betraying nothing of the brewing tension. "What's going on here? Why did you bring her in?" Harris hesitated, his nerves fraying. He had no real justification for what had happened, and deep down, he knew it. But pride was a dangerous thing, and he wasn't about to admit his mistake, not yet. His voice, tight and defensive, came out shaky. I thought she fit the description of a suspect we've been looking for," he stammered. "She was acting suspicious, alone in the park. Not cooperating when I asked for ID. I had to bring her in." Bennett's eyes narrowed, and she glanced at the desk officer, who had already begun typing into the computer. There was no doubt in her mind now that this was a case of racial profiling. She had seen it far too many times, and the details didn't add up. "I see," Bennett said, her voice cool. "But does that justify an arrest without any evidence? Did you even make an attempt to de-escalate the situation?" Harris shifted uneasily. His throat tightened, and he avoided her gaze. He hadn't considered the approach he should have taken. His assumptions had overridden his training, and now he was facing the consequences of his blind bias. Samantha, meanwhile, stood silently, her gaze steady but her mind alert. This wasn't the first time she had been mistaken for someone she wasn't, but the stakes were much higher today. She was used to being underestimated and undervalued, but now, it wasn't just her reputation at risk. It was the entire system. She couldn't let that go unchallenged. "Is this really happening right now?" she thought. "This officer doesn't even realize the depth of what he's done." Captain Bennett looked at Samantha now, her expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry this happened to you," she said quietly. "We'll get this sorted out." Samantha gave a small nod, her voice calm but firm. "Thank you, Captain, but I'm not just here to have this sorted out. I'm here because this shouldn't have happened at all." The words hit Harris like a punch to the gut. He knew what she meant. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of something much bigger, something ingrained in the way law enforcement operated, a system of assumptions and biases that he had allowed to cloud his judgment. He wanted to speak, to justify his actions, but nothing came out. The truth hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. Bennett took a step back and looked at Harris. "You'll need to process her release immediately. We're going to have a conversation about this. You and I, now." Harris's face turned pale and he nodded silently, his eyes downcast. He walked over to the desk and fumbled with the keys to unlock the handcuffs. The metallic click echoed in the room, a symbol of his growing realization that he had just made a costly error. Samantha rubbed her wrists as the cuffs were removed, the lingering tension in her body slowly easing. The entire process, though far from over, had already made its mark. She looked at Harris one last time before turning her attention to Bennett. The room was thick with unspoken words. "Thank you, Captain," she said, her voice steady but carrying a quiet power. "But this isn't just about an apology. It's about systemic change, about understanding why this happened." "Why it always happens," Bennett nodded, her expression thoughtful. She knew that this was the moment to begin addressing the root of the issue, to ensure that it didn't repeat itself in the future. "You're absolutely right," she said. "This is just the beginning. And I promise you this won't be swept under the rug." With that, Bennett turned to Officer Harris, her gaze firm. "Go sit in my office, Officer Harris. We need to talk." As Harris walked toward her office, his steps slow and reluctant, Samantha remained standing in the booking area, feeling the weight of the moment. She knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning of a larger battle, but as she looked at Captain Bennett, she felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, the wheels of change were beginning to turn. The next few hours were a blur of paperwork and discussions between Bennett and Harris. Inside her office, the conversation between the two officers was intense, yet civil. Bennett's voice was calm but authoritative, while Harris seemed to shrink under the pressure. The evidence against him, his own actions, the body cam footage, the witness accounts, all pointed to the same truth. He had acted on assumptions, not evidence, and his behavior was unacceptable. "Do you understand the seriousness of what you've done, Officer Harris?" Bennett asked, her voice unwavering. I do," Harris replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought I was doing my job," Bennett sighed. "You didn't do your job, Officer Harris. You let your biases take over, and that's not something we can allow in this department. Your actions have consequences, and we have to face them." "I'm sorry," Harris muttered, his eyes cast down. "Sorry isn't enough," Bennett said, her tone hardening. "You will be placed on administrative leave while we conduct a full review. If this investigation confirms that your actions were influenced by racial bias, you may face further disciplinary action, including termination." The weight of her words settled on him like a ton of bricks. He knew he had crossed a line, but hearing it from Bennett made it feel real, almost suffocating. He had failed, and now, the department he had served for years was holding him accountable. Meanwhile, in the lobby, Samantha waited for the final steps of her release. She could feel the eyes of other officers on her, some curious, some apologetic. She knew what they were thinking. A black woman, a lawyer, wrongfully arrested. But she wasn't here for sympathy. She wasn't here for an apology. She was here to ensure that this didn't happen again. And for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of resolve building inside her. This was just one officer, one moment, but the ripple effect could lead to real change. She wouldn't let this go unnoticed. As the door to Bennett's office opened, Harris emerged, his face pale and his posture slumped. He avoided eye contact with Samantha, his shame evident. Bennett followed closely behind, her gaze meeting Samantha's with a nod. "It's over," Bennett said quietly. "You're free to go." The precinct felt quieter now. The usual buzz of activity had dimmed as everyone waited for the fallout from the incident that had shaken the department. In the days following Samantha's wrongful arrest, the conversation about race, bias, and accountability became unavoidable. As she stepped out of the booking area and into the calm of the lobby, Samantha couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. She had been vindicated, but the journey wasn't over. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. The events of that day were bigger than her, and she knew it. Every person who had faced racial bias, every moment of injustice in the system, it was all tied to the fight she was now in. As she walked through the precinct, the eyes of officers followed her. Some were filled with regret, others with a mix of guilt and shame. But most of all, they were uncomfortable. They knew what had happened here, and they knew that it wasn't going away. Samantha reached Captain Bennett's office, the door ajar. Inside, Bennett was sitting at her desk, her expression focused, but not without a trace of weariness. She looked up as Samantha entered, offering her a small, genuine smile. "Good to see you again," Bennett said, standing to greet her. "Thank you for your patience." Samantha nodded, taking a seat across from her. "I think we both know this is far from over," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a steeliness in her words. She wasn't just talking about her case. She was talking about the larger issue at hand, the systemic problems within the department. Bennett leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. She had been with the force long enough to know how difficult it could be to change the culture. And yet, in the wake of what had happened with Harris, She was committed to pushing forward. "You're right," she replied. "This is just one step. We've got work to do." Meanwhile, Officer Harris sat alone in the break room, his mind spinning. He couldn't shake the feeling of what had happened. The arrest, the consequences, the look on Samantha's face when she revealed her identity. His thoughts churned, but there was no clarity, just guilt. He had been a cop for over 2 decades. He had always believed in justice, in doing the right thing. But in that moment with Samantha, he had failed. And the weight of that failure was crushing. The door opened, and Officer Jenkins, a younger officer who had witnessed the incident from afar, entered the room. He paused when he saw Harris sitting there, his face unreadable. "Hey, you okay?" Jenkins asked softly, his eyes filled with concern. Harris didn't respond immediately. He couldn't. His voice felt too thick to speak. Instead, he looked up at Jenkins, his face a mask of exhaustion. "I don't know what happened," he muttered. I thought I was doing the right thing." Jenkins sat down across from him. "It's not about what you thought, Brian. It's about what you did." Harris swallowed hard, the truth of those words sinking deep into his chest. "I know," he whispered. "I know." Back in Bennett's office, Samantha and the captain were discussing the next steps. Bennett had already begun taking action within the department. She was speaking to internal affairs, calling in community leaders, and beginning the difficult task of addressing the deeper issues at play. "We're going to change the training protocols," Bennett said, her voice firm with resolve. "We'll implement a deeper focus on racial bias and de-escalation tactics. The department has to understand that it's not enough to just follow the rules. They have to understand the people they serve. We need more empathy in this job and less judgment." Samantha nodded thoughtfully. "It's a good start, but it has to be more than just training. It has to be about accountability. Those who act on prejudice need to face real consequences. This isn't just about one bad cop. This is about a culture that allows these things to happen over and over again." Bennett leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I agree. Harris's actions have consequences, but this department's culture has consequences too, and that's the real work we need to focus on. We can't just punish bad behavior. We need to change how officers view their job and the people they're sworn to protect." Samantha was quiet for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "And what about the community? They need to know this isn't just a one-off. They need to see real change happening." Bennett met her eyes, her expression resolute. "We're going to hold community forums. I'll be transparent with them. I'll show them what we're doing to fix this, and we'll listen to their concerns. This can't be top-down. We need to be a part of the community we serve." Samantha's heart lifted slightly. "I'm glad to hear that. It's a start. But don't let this be a moment of reaction. Let it be the catalyst for real, long-lasting change." Bennett's lips tightened in a brief smile. "I'll make sure it is. And I'll need your help, Samantha. We need advocates like you to ensure this doesn't just become a footnote in history." Samantha stood up, extending her hand across the desk. "I'll do whatever I can. For the people who need it, and for justice." Bennett shook her hand firmly. "Thank you. I appreciate it. Let's make this count." Officer Harris had been told to stay home while the department conducted its review. His pride had been shattered, and the reality of his mistake was hitting him hard. He spent the days that followed replaying the incident in his mind over and over again. The moment he had approached Samantha in the park, his assumptions clouding his judgment. The moment she revealed who she was, and the crushing realization that he had just arrested a fellow professional, someone who had a right to be there, just as much as anyone else, one evening. As he sat at home in the quiet stillness of his apartment, Harris made a decision. He knew it wasn't enough to just apologize. He couldn't change what he had done, but he could make sure he never repeated it. He wasn't going to let his mistakes define him, but he also couldn't allow himself to stay silent. He needed to speak up. Samantha walked out of Bennett's office with a sense of purpose. She had been heard, but this was just one battle won in a much larger war. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see a message from an old colleague. The message read, "We need your help." The case just got bigger. The world outside the precinct was still full of challenges, but for the first time in a long time, Samantha felt a flicker of hope. The change she had hoped for was possible. It wouldn't be easy. It would require a lot of work and a lot of time. But it was possible. As she left the building, the cool evening air hit her face, and she took a deep breath. She wasn't done, not by a long shot. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been silenced, overlooked, or wronged by the system. She was going to keep fighting for them, for all of them. Days had passed since Samantha's wrongful arrest, but the echoes of that moment lingered in the precinct, reverberating through the halls of the department and beyond. While she was free to go, she knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something much larger. The fallout from Officer Harris's actions had only just begun, and the work to create lasting change had to be addressed swiftly and thoroughly. Samantha sat in her office the next day, reviewing her case files, but her mind kept wandering back to the precinct. The conversation she had with Captain Bennett was fresh in her mind. Bennett's promise to reform the department, to tackle racial bias, was encouraging, but the real work, the hard work, was still ahead. Her phone buzzed. The text message from Captain Bennett read, "We're holding a meeting with the city's leaders and community representatives tomorrow. It's time to take action. We need you there." Samantha stared at the message for a moment, feeling a surge of determination. This was exactly what she needed. She wasn't just going to sit back and let the system fix itself. She needed to be there, ready to push, ready to make sure the right changes were made, and not just for her, but for the countless others who had been unfairly treated in similar situations. She had always believed in the power of the law to protect people, but the reality of her own experience had made her realize that change didn't just happen on its own. It had to be fought for. The following day, the meeting room in the city hall was packed. City leaders, community activists, lawyers, and representatives from the police department filled the space. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. It was rare that so many important voices were gathered in one room, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like something meaningful was about to happen. Captain Bennett stood at the front of the room, her face serious. The topic was clear: police reform and racial bias in the department. She had spent the last few days putting together a comprehensive plan, one that included mandatory bias training, changes in policing protocols, and an increased focus on transparency within the department. But it wasn't just about policy. It was about the people who lived in the city, the people who felt unsafe, the ones who had experienced injustice at the hands of officers who were supposed to protect them. Bennett addressed the crowd. "This is about more than just one officer's mistake. This is about a culture that allows these mistakes to happen, and it's time we face it head on. We have to do better, not just for our city, but for every person who walks these streets." Samantha stood at the back of the room, observing the faces in front of her, some angry, others hopeful. She was there not just as a lawyer, but as someone who had lived the pain of systemic injustice. She had felt the sting of being treated differently because of the color of her skin. And today she wasn't just going to watch from the sidelines. She was here to make sure the changes being discussed were real, sustainable, and would make a difference. When Bennett finished her speech, she motioned for Samantha to come forward. The room fell silent as she walked to the front. As she stood behind the podium, her heart raced, but she steadied her breath, knowing what needed to be said. She had been through so much to get here. This was her chance to ensure that Officer Harris's actions were not just swept under the rug. "I was arrested by Officer Harris 2 days ago. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because of the color of my skin," Samantha began, her voice calm but filled with the weight of truth. She paused for a moment, allowing her words to settle. "You see, it's not about what I did or didn't do. It's about the assumptions people make about me just by looking at me. And it's not just me. It's the countless others who have faced the same bias, the same unjust treatment. People like me are arrested, profiled, and treated as less than simply because of how we look." She let the room absorb her words, knowing that her story was not just hers, but the story of many others who couldn't speak up. She could feel the tension in the room shift, as though her vulnerability had made everyone reconsider the status quo. "This isn't just about holding one officer accountable," she continued. "This is about holding the system accountable. It's about ensuring that every person who walks these streets, regardless of their race, feels safe, valued, and heard. It's about dismantling the prejudices that have been built into this system and replacing them with a culture of respect, empathy, and justice. There was a pause. The room was still. No one spoke for a few moments, as if everyone was weighing her words. Then slowly the murmurs began. A few voices echoed in agreement, others in frustration, but all acknowledging the truth in Samantha's message. Captain Bennett stepped forward after Samantha finished speaking, her expression firm but understanding. We're not just listening today. We're acting. We will review our policies, revise our training, and we will create systems of oversight to ensure this doesn't happen again. This is just the beginning, but it's a start. We have a long road ahead. The meeting continued with a renewed sense of purpose. Community leaders spoke about their own experiences with police bias. Some shared personal stories of friends and family who had faced discrimination. Others discussed the need for better representation in law enforcement and the importance of community engagement in creating meaningful change. Hours later, Samantha left the meeting with a heavy heart, but a glimmer of hope. The conversations had been hard, the questions uncomfortable, but she knew it was necessary. For too long, the voices of people like her had been silenced, overlooked, or dismissed. But today they had been heard. The changes weren't going to come overnight. She knew that, but today the first step had been taken. There was momentum now, a shared understanding that things had to change, and the work would continue. Samantha made her way home, the weight of the day settling in. She thought about Officer Harris, about the fact that he hadn't even realized how deeply his actions had affected her and how much they had affected so many others. She didn't know if he'd ever truly understand the magnitude of his mistake. But she knew one thing for sure. He wasn't the only one who needed to change. The system needed to change, and that was the fight she was ready for. As she reached her apartment, she looked out over the city. The streets were quiet, but she knew that with each conversation, each moment of truth, the city was slowly shifting. And with it, so was the system. The next day, the precinct was a flurry of activity. Captain Bennett had called in the department's higher-ups, and an emergency meeting was scheduled to discuss Officer Harris's actions and the subsequent fallout. As the officers filed in, there was an air of unease that couldn't be ignored. Everyone knew the tension that had been building in the department for years, but now it was unavoidable. The event with Samantha Turner had become the spark for a much-needed reckoning. Officer Brian Harris sat at the far end of the room, his posture slouched, his eyes trained on the table in front of him. He felt a sense of dread in his stomach, a feeling he hadn't had in years. He had never imagined his actions would lead to such widespread attention. He had always believed himself to be a good cop, a protector of the people, but now he wasn't sure what to think of himself. Captain Bennett entered the room, her presence commanding the attention of everyone present. She was known for her leadership, her fairness, but also her unwavering commitment to accountability. She walked to the front of the room, her face stern. "Let's begin," she said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. "We're here today because of the incident involving Officer Harris and Ms. Samantha Turner. What happened was unacceptable. It was not just a failure of protocol. It was a failure of judgment, and it reflects deeply ingrained issues within this department that we cannot ignore any longer." Harris shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but he didn't look up. He had heard this speech before, but now it felt personal. It was about him, the mistakes he had made, the assumptions he had acted on, and the consequences they had caused. "We will be addressing this incident head-on," Bennett continued. "But we also need to recognize that this isn't just about one officer's actions. This is about a culture that allowed this to happen, a culture that needs to change." Her words echoed in the room. Some officers glanced at each other, uneasy. Others looked straight ahead, avoiding eye contact. The conversation turned to training, to the biases that had been overlooked for years, and to the changes that needed to take place. There were discussions about racial bias training, de-escalation techniques, and how to rebuild trust with the community. "We cannot go back to business as usual," Bennett said, addressing the group. "We need to rethink how we approach every interaction with the community. Our job is to protect and serve, not to judge based on appearance or assumptions. We need to earn back the trust of the people we're meant to serve." Harris swallowed hard as Bennett's words hit him with full force. He had always prided himself on being a by-the-book kind of cop, following protocol to the letter. But he had let his own biases guide him. He hadn't given Samantha Turner the benefit of the doubt. He hadn't questioned why he assumed she didn't belong in the park. And now, the entire department was paying the price for that failure. Meanwhile, Samantha was not at the precinct. She had been busy with her own efforts, ensuring that this incident wasn't forgotten. She had been in touch with local community leaders, offering her support for the ongoing push for police reform. But the deeper she dug into the issue, the more she realized how widespread the problem was. It wasn't just one officer, it was a systemic issue. Harris had acted on assumptions, yes, but those assumptions were built into a larger structure of racial profiling that had been normalized for years. As she sat in her office, reviewing case files and drafting documents for the ongoing reform efforts, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Captain Bennett. "We're making progress, but we need you to come in. I want you to be part of the department's new focus group on reform. Your voice is invaluable in this process." Samantha stared at the message, her heart pounding. It was one thing to fight for justice in court, but this was different. This was about creating real change within the very system that had wronged her. It was an opportunity to use her experience, her voice, to ensure that this moment wasn't just a blip in the department's history, but the start of something lasting. She knew this was her chance to make an impact, not just for her, but for every person who had ever been unjustly treated because of their race. As the days went by, the internal discussions within the precinct continued. Officer Harris was placed on administrative leave while the department conducted its review. He had been stripped of his authority, his badge, and his credibility. His colleagues, once respectful, now avoided eye contact. He was a pariah, and the weight of that isolation was unbearable. Harris had been suspended from active duty pending the review of the incident, but the feeling of disgrace followed him everywhere. The scrutiny was constant, both from his fellow officers and the public. He had never imagined that a routine patrol could lead to a moment like this. But now, as he sat in his apartment alone, he had to come to terms with what he had done. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years, the number of his old mentor, a retired officer who had taught him the ropes when he first joined the force. "Hello?" The voice on the other end of the line answered, gruff and familiar. "Hey, it's Brian," Harris said, his voice low. "I need to talk." There was a pause before his mentor responded. "Come by. We'll talk." In the following days, as Officer Harris faced the consequences of his actions, Samantha continued her work in the community, pushing for real reform. She attended town halls, met with community activists, and helped organize meetings with city leaders. The public discussions were often heated, with some calling for greater accountability and others pushing back against the perceived attack on law enforcement. But through it all, Samantha stood firm in her belief that change was necessary. Every conversation, every encounter, felt like another small step toward creating a system that treated people fairly, no matter the color of their skin. And though it seemed like an impossible task at times, Samantha knew that she couldn't give up. She had seen how even small moments of change could shift an entire culture. This moment, this department, could be that shift. The weeks that followed Samantha's wrongful arrest were filled with meetings, long discussions, and a growing sense of momentum for change. The precinct's internal review process was still underway, and Officer Harris, now on administrative leave, found himself in an agonizing limbo. He was no longer the officer everyone respected. Instead, he was a symbol of the failure that had plagued the department for years. Every conversation he overheard, every glance from a colleague was a reminder of his misstep. Samantha, on the other hand, had thrown herself into the reform efforts. She had become more than just a symbol of what needed to change. She was now a driving force behind the push for accountability. Her involvement in the department's newly formed focus group on police reform had allowed her to work closely with Captain Bennett, local activists and community leaders, creating a network that could demand real, lasting change. The department's new training programs, focused on racial bias, de-escalation, and empathy, were beginning to take shape. But Samantha knew that this was only the first step. One evening, as Samantha sat in her office reflecting on the progress made, Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Captain Bennett. "We need to talk," Bennett said, her voice serious but steady. "There's something we need to address." Samantha agreed to meet, and within the hour, she found herself sitting across from Bennett in the captain's office. Bennett closed the door behind her and took a seat, her face a mixture of determination and concern. "I've been thinking a lot about the progress we've made," Bennett started. "And while we've made some important strides, we're not there yet. The reform we're working on isn't just for today, it's for the long haul. We need to think about how we can make sure this isn't just a reaction to a single incident." Samantha nodded, understanding what Bennett was getting at. "We can't afford to have this be a temporary fix. People need to see that we're committed to changing the culture of this department, not just the rules." "Exactly," Bennett replied. "I've spoken with the city council, and they're ready to take the next step. But they need to see the department's commitment. They need to know that we're not just addressing the symptoms, but the root causes. That means transparency, accountability, and real oversight." Samantha took a deep breath. This wasn't going to be easy. Changing a system that had been in place for so long was a monumental task. But she couldn't back down now, not after everything that had happened. She had to keep pushing. "What can I do to help?" she asked, her voice firm with resolve. Bennett leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Samantha's. "We need your voice, your experience. You're not just a lawyer. You're a part of this community. We need you to help lead the charge for real, systemic change. This has to go beyond the precinct. It needs to be a citywide movement. We need to involve local leaders, activists, and the people most affected by these issues." Samantha felt a surge of determination. She had known that this would be a long and difficult process. But now, it felt like the pieces were finally falling into place. She had spent years fighting cases in court, trying to bring about justice for her clients. But now the fight was bigger than any single case. This was about dismantling the very systems that allowed injustice to persist. "I'm in," she said, her voice unwavering. "Let's make this happen." Meanwhile, Officer Harris was forced to face the consequences of his actions. The internal review had found that his arrest of Samantha Turner had been a result of racial profiling, and as a result, he was recommended for termination. He had spent the last few weeks reflecting on the situation, and the weight of his mistake was heavy on him. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, but now, the truth of his failure was undeniable. As he sat in his small apartment one evening, staring at the termination notice in his hands, he felt a deep sense of shame. But there was something else, too, something he hadn't expected. A flicker of understanding. He had failed. But in that failure, he had learned something about himself and the system he had been a part of. Harris had made a choice that day, to act on his biases instead of his training. He had made assumptions based on a woman's appearance, and those assumptions had led to an arrest that should never have happened. But in the weeks since that moment, he had been forced to confront the reality of his actions. He had seen the effect they had on Samantha, on his colleagues, and on the community. He had failed them all. The realization hit him like a wave. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the future. Harris wasn't sure what that future looked like, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't stay silent. He had to make amends, even if it meant facing the consequences of his actions head-on. Samantha's work didn't slow down. Her efforts to push for reform continued as she worked with Bennett and other city leaders to finalize the new training programs. But she was also receiving increasing pressure from the community, many of whom wanted more immediate, visible results. There were protests, petitions, and heated debates in the local news. People were frustrated, and rightfully so. They didn't want to wait for incremental change. They wanted it now. One afternoon, Samantha found herself standing at a podium in front of a crowd of people gathered outside City Hall. She had been invited to speak at a rally calling for an end to police brutality and systemic racism. The crowd was large, diverse, and passionate. They wanted answers, and they wanted change. As she stepped up to the microphone, she felt a surge of emotion. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. This was about all the injustices that had gone unspoken for far too long. "I'm here today not just because of what happened to me, but because of what happens to so many others," Samantha began, her voice strong and steady. "This system has failed us. But we can change it. We can make sure that no one else is unjustly arrested. No one else is profiled. No one else has to face the kind of treatment I did. But we need all of you. We need your voices, your power, and your strength to make this happen. The crowd erupted in applause. But Samantha's words didn't just resonate with the people in front of her. They reverberated through the entire city. The movement had begun.